Hey, this is Dr. Corey Glenn. In this video, I'm going to be showing how to use the bone reduction templates and also prosthetic spacers that I've developed for, expediting full arch cases. All right, so I'm not going to do the case from A to Z just to keep things moving along. So I've already got bone segmentation done. I've done a wax up for this case, and this was based on smile design, so I know ideally where the teeth belong. And that's a big part of my workflow is I don't even start with the implants until I know exactly where the ideal teeth belong. Here we have that. And so I'm going to give you an example on the upper and the lower here of how I would use these. So let's suppose that now we wanted to place some implants, and suppose that we wanted on the maxillary arch to have 14 millimeters of prosthetic space. All right. I have these spacers from 12 all the way up to 17 millimeters of prosthetic space. So 12 is more in the realm of an FP1. 17 is really on the high end for a hybrid, but anyway, they're there. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull one of those in, and I'm going to grab this 14 millimeter spacer right here. Now you'll notice that I've got some that are labeled 14 and then some 14 that are 3 millimeters thick. I'll show the latter on the lower arch when we do that. All right, so I'm going to just drag this in to the case. And don't worry about aligning it because there's nothing to align to really. And so here's what this thing is. So if I'm in the model manipulation panel, I can just now turn on the manual alignment. And my goal is I want to get this thing set up where it is more or less aligned to the patient's anatomy. So there's roughly midline. And then this horizontal component in the middle, that is what needs to align to the occlusal plane. All right, so I'm going to spin this up a little bit and then drag it forward. So just to give you a preview, basically this will create where we need to place the implants depth-wise, and then it's also going to be what does your bone reduction. All right, so you don't want it to go way back here. Notice that's why it tapers out like it does here. So I would say about right there, you can see that the occlusal plane aspect has this little midline indicator, so I'll usually try to line that up right there. And then I'm just eyeballing the occlusal plane, because our implants need to be placed prosthetically driven. This is the ideal teeth, and the implants need to get placed ideally from that. So now that we've got that, we could go ahead and begin aligning implants to it. All right, so to keep things moving, I've done 4 maxillary implants, but I'll show you how I would utilize this now to assist me in placing them at the correct depth and everything like that. All right, so let's start with this implant right here. I've got one that is disto-angled slightly, just it's a little too deep right here. So what I'll do is unlock this, and again, I'm using the 14 millimeter prosthetic spacer. So this is 14 millimeters from here, which is the occlusal plane, to this. So I need to place my implant so that I can get that 14 millimeters of prosthetic space. And let me turn off the mandible. As well as the lower arch. And you can see here where my prosthetic emergence is. So I'm at the right depth, and I'm in the proper prosthetic emergence. I've already set all these at the proper prosthetic emergence, so I'm just going to demo how I would use this to gauge the depth. And this is a demo case. This is not one that's clinically being done, because we actually did an FP1 on this particular case, but it's a good one to just show the demo on. Alright, once again, depth-wise, I've got 14 millimeters of prosthetic space. So if you know that you're doing a hybrid, for example, that's about the shallowest that implant should go. if you want to maintain 14 millimeters prosthetic space. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of, do I need to do bone reduction? Do I not? You find the ideal teeth, and then you put in the proper prosthetic spacer, and that tells you how deep your implants need to go. And there may be certain scenarios where you look at it and it's like, oh, I don't have enough vertical bone height to go that deep, and thus you need to back up and punt and maybe go with an FP1 or something like that. All right, place that one at proper depth. And then finally we'll look at this one. All right, so there are the implant positions, as you can see right here. Now I can turn the wax up off because I've already positioned the spacer. All right. So at this point, we could go ahead and start using this to make a bone reduction guide. So what I'm going to do for starters is I'm going to just make a straight up guide. I'm not even going to build in tubes to it. I'm just going to make a guide on the maxilla. All right. So I'll time lapse this because hopefully if you're messing with this, you know how to just make a really basic guide. Now, I do want to point out here very quickly that notice I'm drawing my perimeter of my guide ridiculously long, and I'm doing that intentionally because even though I'll never make the guide be this over contoured, once it's done, you can easily trim it back to the contours you want. But if you don't make the contours long enough to start with, it's very difficult to add material to these. So make your perimeter very excessive, and now let's create it. Alright, so as you see here, we have just a simple guide made directly on the bone, and this is what we will repurpose into the bone reduction guide. But very quickly, before I show that, there's one other thing I would suggest you do. After you have positioned your implants, right, you've got them at the right prosthetic depth, but remember, this is what's going to make that cut to create your reduction guide. And so we don't need to go way back behind this distal-most implant, so we could just simply once we know our distal-most implants, we can move this thing up so that cut will taper up and out of the bone as soon as it's past that implant. Alright, maybe something like that. Alright, so now I'll go ahead and demonstrate how we would use this reduction spacer. So first of all, we've positioned this. Notice that it does have an upper and a lower, and that's really useful because that way if you're doing a dual arch case, you're only positioning to that occlusal plane once. But at this point, I really only care about this top part as I'm making the maxillary reduction guide. So my suggestion would be to duplicate it, and that way you've got an extra one of those. All right. And then the one that was the original, I'm going to just name this upper reduction template. And you see I've hidden the original. So I've always got something I can come back to. But now that I've done that, let's just click on it in surfaces, isolate, and that gets rid of everything else. Okay? So how do we now turn this into a reduction guide? Well, believe it or not, you can do Boolean functions within Blue Sky Plan. And so what I'm going to do here is just utilize Blue Sky's Boolean functions. So if you've never used those, they're actually in the Crown and Bridge module. So I'm going to switch over to Crown and Bridge. And now that I'm here, I can just go to the tooth editing panel, and here you see it, Boolean operations. So what if I did a Boolean difference between the guide that we just made, the surgical guide, and the upper reduction template? Alright, you could add additional offset and whatnot, but this is all I want to do here. So when I hit apply, you see that there's a new surface that has been generated. So unlike in Mesh Mixer or some of the other programs, when you Boolean something, you lose that model. Here, I can just hide that. Notice it just creates a new surface. You still have your original. And so look, that's now my reduction guide. Okay. Now, what if you wanted to make a model of the maxilla? Like, what's it going to look like after that amount of reduction has been done? We can do the exact same thing. So let's do a Boolean difference between the maxilla and that same template. And now I can hide the template, and you can hopefully see what we've got here. I'll change the colors just so you can make this out a little easier. All right, let's jump back over to we'll go to Model Master because there's a couple little things that we'll have to clean up here. All right, so first of all, let's hide the reduced maxilla. I would suggest you rename it that. So reduced maxilla. And now we'll hide that. But notice, because that was that guide was building into the sockets here, you're going to have a couple little floating bits like this, and you might have some things like where it built into a socket that you have to manually cut away. And that's, again, not a problem. We could just use the cut tool, and if we didn't want this going into those sockets, we could just cut that out. All right. And then if you want to get rid of the little floating bits, just say isolate, click on what you want to keep. All right, and that all goes away. So this would now be your basic reduction guide. And notice that I did not put any pins in it at this stage, because as sure as you did that, you would do that cut, and it would cut off half your pin tubes. So my suggestion would be wait until this stage, and now we could throw, I'm going to do one pin for example, and show you how I would build that in. So if I go to add an implant, we're going to add a pin, and we'll have to look at that here. So pins, they don't need to go in terribly far, but you do need to think about surgical access. All right, so if your pin was at a flat plane like this, you wouldn't have to worry about what I'm talking about here, but you can't really reflect enough to get that pin in at that direction. So more than likely your pin is going to be like this, and when you turn the tube on, you can imagine if we had built this guide ahead of time with that pin, when I made that cut, it would have cut right through the pins. So what's the alternative? The alternative is that now you could simply build these pin tubes into this guide, and now it doesn't matter that they're out of that plane. All right, so how would I do that? I actually kind of just tricked the software. So if you turned on all your pin tubes and now went into the surgical guide mode, we don't have to remake the guide. What we're going to do instead is just hit this create scan appliance guide. So the software doesn't know if this is a denture or a scan appliance. It just knows, hey, you've got this STL and you want to build these guide tubes in. So whatever guide tubes you have visible. And it's just going to duplicate that object but build in those pin shapes. So that's all we're going to do here, is we're going to select that guide and hit create scan appliance guide. So notice the new object. It's the exact same object, it's just that now it has these pins built in, and I don't have to worry about trying to reassemble it where those things got cut away. Okay, so obviously you would do more than one pin. That's not going to cut it. But just to show a final option here, like, okay, let's suppose that we've got this now, but you don't want your guide to be, this over contoured. What could you do? You could simply just take a cut tool and you could just cut it to whatever height you want. So if you wanted something kind of real thin that wouldn't require as much reflection, you can do that. And you can do this with manual cuts. Now this is a little bit of a pain in the butt because you're going to now have to go in and for example, cut away a lot of this excess in the posterior. It's not that big a deal, but you can do that. That's one option. All right. And then again, we could cut away these corners and all that. You can just cut it down to size that way. And that's one option. If let's suppose you wanted to do a buckle only guide and you're going to print this in maybe metal, or maybe you just want it to rest on the occlusal and then not have the palatal portion, which is something I do relatively often. All right. So just a very fast way to make a reduction guide. Now, what's another alternative? Well, let's go ahead and on the lower, we'll use it using the other template. So I'm going to delete those files real quick. All right, so if you'll remember, I had duplicated that one before, um, isolating it and all that kind of stuff. So if you have followed much of my stuff, I recommend for full arch cases, especially a dual arch, that you take your CT scan in full occlusion, but at the proper VDO. So if they had a collapsed vertical, open them up with something, a Lucia jig, a leaf gauge, and take your CT in centric at the proper VDO. If you'll do that, then as you're positioning the one template, you've already positioned the second one. So this is a case that Danny had worked with me on, and he took those CTs in the proper VDO. So you can see by virtue of having positioned it on the top, it's already positioned on the bottom. So now let's look at our lower implant positions. They're already roughly in the correct spot, but we'll go ahead now and refine them. So I'm going to turn on the hint of my prosthetic spacer. That looks pretty darn good. I want to merge right to that functional cusp. That one looks good. This one I might move just a hair up, depending on if you want to be more or less subcrestal. And here we've got the vertical height to leave everything vertical and still have that proper prosthetic space. So that's a very nice option as opposed to, oftentimes when people are just eyeballing this, they're going to go in and they're just going to mow down bone until maybe 5 millimeters above the mental foramen. Man, if you did that, look how much excess bone would get removed. And, we don't want to do that to a patient. So there's my implant positions. Remember, I want to now taper this thing out. And so I'll just scoot it up a little bit. And I'm going to taper out that reduction just after this distal implant. All right. So remember, I told you that these files, there's one that's labeled 14 millimeter prosthetic spacer. That's this one. All right. Notice that these are a one-dimensional mesh right here. But then you've also got this one labeled 3 millimeters thick. All right, so I'm going to pull that one in here. All right, do you see the difference with it? Now it's out of orientation. But the way I've designed these is they are all designed in the proper orientation to one another. So it's kind of like when you import an opposing model when the patient's not in occlusion, but you want to bring in their opposing intraoral scan in the proper occlusion. Since these were all designed together in the same orientation, what I can do is just say I want to stitch this yellow one to a model and I want to bring it back to that same orientation as this original 14 millimeter. And check that out. Now you've got it already in the right position. Or if you had just wanted to start by using this one in the first place, you can do that as well. Now the thing I need to point out on this one is it's the inside of this that is your labeled spacer. So in this case, 14 millimeters. If you go all the way to this one and then placed it there, that's going to be 17, and you're going to be going way too deep with things. All right. So why have I done it this way? Well, we're going to do the exact same thing as we did in the maxilla. We're going to go ahead and just make an initial guide on the mandible. So that's positioned. We can hide that. And now I'm just going to lock my implants and make a, a normal guide here. So we're making it on the mandible. Define your insertion axis. You know, if you were going buccal only, for example, you would probably want to get an insertion axis like this where you can really see all that buccal bone. If you're going to do it buccal and lingual, you need to probably get more of that approach. I'm going to kind of split the difference, and we'll go, say, right there. Define the insertion from that view. Now, once again, draw your curve really excessive. All right, and being sloppy with it has the additional benefit that you can just go super fast because it absolutely doesn't matter here. No tubes at this point. I'll add them after the fact again. All right, so once again, we've got an initial guide. It's useless right now, but we'll go ahead and show how we would now turn this into our reduction guide. Now this is the one, this is the template that I'll use whenever I'm doing, you know, my metal guides, because it's designed to make just a 3 mm thick guide. So let's go back into the Boolean functions in the crown and bridge module. Okay, and now we can do, instead of doing a Boolean difference, right, remember it's this inside plane that is actually your proper level of reduction. Instead of doing that, let's do an intersection, which means wherever this red and this yellow intersect, that's all we want to keep. So we're going to do a Boolean intersection between this spacer and this red guide, and no offsets or anything. Alright, so it's finished. I'm going to have to hide these things. So again, look how over contoured that guide was to start with. And now look at this. I'll hide all the implants. Do you see how now that is just where it intersected? And that guide was, or that spacer was only 3 mm thick throughout. So your guide is an exact, consistent 3 mm, almost contoured bar that wraps around the mandible here. Once again, you'll have a couple little extra pieces that you can just isolate. Those little spots you can cut away. And then once again, we could do the reduction of the jaw as well, but you're going to not be able to use the 3 mm thick one. Okay, you will have to use that one-dimensional mesh plane to do the bone reduction, because remember, otherwise it'll reduce the mandible to 3 mm below where you actually want it. But this is super useful. Now I can come back into advanced mode. I'm going to isolate this to get rid of any of those little floating pieces, and then I'm going to cut away anywhere that it's dropping into the socket. And now you've got a really nice reduction guide. And once again, if you want to add pins to it, now would be the time to do it after this has been made, because we can simply add the pins. I'll do just a single pin here once again. And you're thinking about surgical access. So you don't want to have to flap them down to their liver to get this pin in place. So I'll usually come, you know, something like that. Turn on the guide tube. I'm pretending this would be a metal guide, so I'm making it a much smaller diameter hole. You can also come up here and in your preferences, you can change the guide tube wall thickness. So if I was printing this guide in metal, I'd probably only make the guide tube wall thickness be about 0.75. And you can see that's a much thinner contour pin tube. So again, even though I've only done one here, let's just now see what it would look like to position, this pin and maybe one here and one here, or however many you want, and then go into guide panel. We're going to now turn on all the pin tubes that we want to add, and to this lower guide, we want to just say create a scan appliance guide. And hopefully now you can see how that has built in the pin tubes to this. And once again, if you want it to be buckle only, just cut this away. If you want it to have some little saddles and just kind of hook on the occlusal, then do that. But if you want it to go full contour, that's already going to be in that position. Okay, so again, I really like these templates. They're very useful for making sure my implants are deep enough to have the right prosthetic space, but then it also very much simplifies my life as far as making my reduction guide, making my reduced jaw models, because I print all that stuff. And so if you want to use these, they are available for purchase on the website. It's coryglenn.org, and then look under the downloads, and you should be able to see these under bone reduction templates and prosthetic spacers. And that file is going to contain the 12 through the 17 millimeter spacers in both the first one I demoed and the 3 millimeter thick one that I've just shown right here. All right, so hopefully you found that useful, and we'll see you next time.